Sometimes the hardest choice a man can make is knowing when to let go of something he loves. Apache warrior Hasken stands at the edge of a raging river, his dying horse trembling beside him, both of them broken from battles that left scars deeper than flesh. But watching from the banks is 8-year-old Sani, an orphaned girl who knows this horse better than anyone. What Hasken doesn't see is that she's been secretly healing the animal for weeks, and she's not about to let him give up now, with nothing but old medicine and a child's fierce hope. She steps into the water after them. But will her plan be enough to save them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Apache camp, nestled in the rocky canyon of southeastern Arizona territory. It was October 1891, and the world Hasken had known since boyhood was disappearing like smoke in the desert wind. The government agents had been through 3 times this year alone, each visit bringing new rules, new boundaries, new ways to shrink the space where his people could simply exist. Hasken, running bare, sat cross-legged before his wickiup, methodically, sharpening a knife that had seen more battles than most men twice his age. At 32, he carried himself with the bearing of a war chief, though the title meant little now. His weathered face bore the faded remnants of ceremonial war paint, red ochre and white clay, that told the story of the Chiricahua resistance, of raids against cavalry units, of nights spent moving silently through enemy territory. The paint had become part of him, worked so deeply into the lines around his eyes that no amount of washing could remove it entirely. The knife blade caught the morning light as he tested its edge against his thumb, sharp enough to skin a deer or slit a throat, though these days it was more likely to whittle toys for the children or repair torn leather. His hands, scarred from countless battles, moved with the practiced precision of a man who had learned that preparation could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise and feeding the buzzards. Around him, the camp stirred to life with the gentle sounds of a people trying to maintain their dignity in increasingly difficult circumstances. Women emerged from their homes to tend cooking fires, their movements graceful despite the weight of worry that had settled over the community like a heavy blanket. Children ran between the wickiups, their laughter a bright spot in a world grown too serious too quickly. But even their play had changed. Fewer war games now, more practicing the English words the government school teachers demanded they learn. In the distance, Hasken could see old grandfather Kohana leading the morning prayers, his voice carrying across the canyon as he offered tobacco to the 4 directions. The elders' words seemed to echo differently these days, as if even the spirits were having trouble hearing them over the sound of progress marching steadily westward. Hasken's thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling from behind his dwelling. He turned to see a small figure moving carefully between the wickiups, trying to remain unseen. 8-year-old Sani, whispering wind, carried herself with an unusual stillness for a child her age, as if she understood that the world required a different kind of attention now. Her dark hair hung in 2 neat braids, woven with small beads that had belonged to her grandmother. Her clothing was simple but well made, a traditional dress that her guardian, old Ixchilmeni horses, had sewn from traded cloth and decorated, with patterns that told the story of her lineage. Sani moved like water flowing around rocks, naturally avoiding the areas where she might be noticed. In her small hands, she carried a worn leather pouch that seemed too precious for such young fingers. Hasken watched her with growing curiosity as she made her way toward the edge of camp where the horses were kept. The girl had been orphaned 2 years ago when her father, swift arrow dancing, fell in battle against a cavalry patrol near Skeleton Canyon. Her mother had died in childbirth, leaving Sani to be raised by the tribal elders. But rather than being broken by loss, the child had seemed to absorb wisdom from every adult around her, particularly from her grandmother, old Ixchel, who had been the tribe's medicine woman until her death 6 months ago. Hasken had noticed Sani's unusual behavior for weeks now. While other children slept, she would slip out of her guardian's wickiup and disappear into the darkness. He had assumed she was grieving in her own way, perhaps visiting her father's grave marker on the hill above camp. But watching her now, moving with such purpose toward the horse herd, he began to suspect something else entirely. The horses stood in a natural corral formed by towering red rocks and a fence of woven branches. Most were the hardy mustangs that had served the Apache people for generations, small, tough animals bred for endurance rather than beauty. But among them stood one horse that commanded attention even in its current weakened state. Thunderwalker had once been the pride of the Apache horse herd, a magnificent paint stallion with a coat of brown and white that seemed to flow like water. He had carried swift arrow dancing through more battles than any horse should survive. The animal possessed an intelligence that bordered on supernatural, seeming to anticipate his rider's needs before they were spoken. Together, horse and warrior had become legendary among both Apache and cavalry forces for their ability to appear where least expected and disappear when pursuit seemed certain. But Thunderwalker had returned from that final battle without his rider, bearing wounds that spoke of a desperate fight and a narrow escape. The horse had been found 3 days after the battle, standing guard over Swift Arrow's empty rifle near a waterhole 20 miles from where the warrior had fallen. Since then, the magnificent stallion had been slowly declining, as if the loss of his partner had taken something essential from his spirit. Now Thunderwalker stood apart from the other horses, his head hanging low, his once proud stance reduced to a weary endurance. His ribs showed clearly through his dull coat, and his eyes had lost the fire that had once made cavalry horses shy away from his presence. To most observers, the horse appeared to be dying by degrees, his body giving up the fight that his spirit had already abandoned. Hasken rose from his seat and moved silently to a position where he could observe without being seen. What he witnessed challenged everything he thought he knew about the quiet orphan girl. Sani approached Thunderwalker with none of the hesitation that most people, even experienced horsemen, showed around the grieving stallion. The horse lifted his head as she drew near, and Hasken could see something pass between them, a recognition, perhaps even a greeting. The girl reached into her leather pouch and withdrew what appeared to be a mixture of ground herbs and roots. She offered it to Thunderwalker on her palm, speaking to him in the old language with words too soft for Hasken to hear. The horse accepted the offering, his muzzle gentle against the child's small hand. Then Sani began to examine him with the methodical attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Her fingers traced old scars, pressed gently against his sides, and felt along his legs for heat or swelling. This was not the random affection of a child for an animal. This was the practiced examination of a healer. Hasken watched in growing amazement as Sani produced a series of items from her pouch. Small bundles of herbs, a carved bone implement he recognized as a tool used by medicine people, and a piece of smooth stone that had been shaped for applying healing salves. She worked with the confidence of someone following procedures learned through careful instruction, her movements economical and purposeful. As she worked, Sani spoke to Thunderwalker in a voice that carried across the morning air like a song. She told him about his warrior, about the battles they had fought together, about the children who still spoke his name with reverence. But she also spoke of healing, of the possibility that grief need not be a death sentence, and of the medicine that could repair what war had broken. Thunderwalker stood perfectly still during her ministrations, as if he understood that this small healer offered something different from the sympathy and resignation he had received from everyone else. When she finished, she rested her forehead against his neck in a gesture of such tenderness that Hasken felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The girl gathered her supplies and prepared to leave, but not before making Thunderwalker a promise. "Tomorrow I will bring stronger medicine," she whispered. "The kind grandmother taught me, for when the spirit is wounded along with the body. You are not ready to join Father in the spirit world. There is still work for you to do." As Sani melted back into the camp, moving once again like shadow and mist, Hasken found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about healing, about hope, and about the wisdom that could reside in the most unexpected places. The child possessed knowledge that went far beyond her years, and she was applying it to save an animal that everyone else, including himself, had already given up for dead. But even as admiration for the girl's determination filled his chest, Hasken felt the familiar weight of hard-earned experience pressing down on him. He had seen too many battles, lost too many friends, watched too many good things die despite every effort to save them. Sometimes mercy was the kindest gift you could offer. Sometimes letting go was the only choice that made sense. Thunderwalker was dying. Hasken could see it in the way the horse moved, in the dullness of his coat, in the resignation that had settled over him like a burial shroud. All the herbs and healing songs in the world could not bring back swift arrow dancing, and without his warrior, the horse, was simply a ghost waiting for release. As Hasken returned to his wickiup, his mind was already made up. He would not let the child continue this futile effort. He would not watch her pour her young heart into a hopeless cause. Tomorrow, he would take Thunderwalker to the river and grant him the mercy that Sani, in her innocence and inexperience, could not bring herself to provide. Dawn broke cold and grey over the canyon, the kind of morning that seemed to drain color from the world and leave everything looking like an old photograph. Hasken had slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of dying horses and the faces of warriors who would never see another sunrise. He carried these ghosts with him everywhere now, a personal cavalry that rode through his thoughts at unexpected moments. He made his way to the horse corral before the camp fully awakened, moving with the silent steps that had kept him alive through a dozen ambushes. The broken arrow shaft in his belt, snapped during a failed hunt 3 weeks ago, pressed against his hip with each step. He had kept it as a reminder of how even the most carefully prepared efforts could end in failure. Some things were simply meant to break. Thunderwalker stood exactly where Hasken had expected to find him, separate from the other horses, his magnificent head hanging low, as if the weight of grief had finally become too much to bear. The stallion's breathing was labored, each exhale visible in the cold morning air. His legs trembled slightly as he shifted his weight, and Hasken could see that standing had become an effort requiring conscious will. This was what Hasken had feared. What he had known was coming, despite the child's determined efforts. Thunderwalker was dying, and all the herbs and healing songs in the world could not change that fundamental truth. The horse had simply lost the will to continue fighting a battle that could not be won. Hasken approached slowly, speaking in the old language, his voice gentle but firm. "Old friend," he said, "your warrior calls to you from the spirit world. It is time to answer." Thunderwalker lifted his head with visible effort, his dark eyes meeting Hasken's with a look that seemed to carry years of shared understanding. These two had seen battle together, had felt the rush of cavalry charges and the chaos of running fights through the mountains. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words. The decision was not made lightly, but it was made with the certainty that came from experience. Hasken had seen too many creatures suffer needlessly, had watched good horses die slowly, from wounds that would never heal properly. Mercy sometimes wore the face of ending rather than prolonging, and true compassion required the courage to act when action was needed most. He fashioned a simple halter from a length of rope and slipped it gently over Thunderwalker's head. The horse made no effort to resist, as if he too understood that this moment had been inevitable from the day his warrior fell. Together, they began the slow walk toward the river that ran along the eastern edge of the canyon. The path wound between towering red rocks and sparse desert vegetation, following a route that generations of Apache had used to reach the water. It should have been a peaceful walk, but Hasken found himself listening for sounds that did not belong, the soft footsteps of someone following at a distance, the rustle of movement among the rocks. He was not surprised when Sani appeared, emerging from behind a boulder with the sudden materialization that seemed to be her particular gift. Her small face was set with determination that made her look far older than her 8 years, and her dark eyes blazed with an intensity that reminded Hasken uncomfortably of her grandmother during healing ceremonies. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice carrying across the morning air with startling authority. "Thunder Walker is not ready to die." Hasken stopped, feeling the familiar weight of patience that came from dealing with those who had not yet learned the harder truths of existence. "Little one," he said gently, "sometimes we must accept what cannot be changed. Thunder Walker suffers. It is time to let him go." But Sani stepped directly into his path, her small form blocking the way forward with surprising effectiveness. "He is healing," she insisted. "The medicines are working. His spirit is growing stronger each day." Looking down at Thunder Walker, Hasken saw only what he had seen for weeks. A dying horse whose body was slowly surrendering to wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone. The stallion's coat remained dull, his stance weak, his eyes clouded with the kind of resignation that preceded death. Whatever the child thought she was accomplishing with her herbs and ceremonies, it was not enough to overcome the simple reality of the situation. "Sani," Hasken said, his voice carrying the patience of someone explaining something to a beloved but misguided child. "Healing is not always possible. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is end suffering." The girl's response surprised him with its vehemence. "You know nothing about healing," she declared, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. "You only know about killing and dying and giving up. Thunder Walker is not ready to join my father. He has told me so himself." Hasken felt a familiar stirring of irritation at being challenged by someone who had barely lived long enough to understand the complexities of existence. The child's certainty, while admirable in its way, was based on hope rather than experience. She had not watched enough good creatures die to understand that sometimes death was not an enemy to be defeated, but a mercy to be embraced. "What has he told you?" Hasken asked, his tone carrying just enough edge to make it clear that his patience was not unlimited. "What words has a dying horse spoken to convince you that suffering should continue?" Sani's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but when she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "He has told me that his wounds are healing, that the herbs grandmother taught me are driving out the poison in his blood. He has told me that his strength returns a little more each day, and that he feels his warrior's spirit watching over him with approval, not calling him to die." The certainty in her voice was absolute, the kind of conviction that could only come from someone who had not yet learned to doubt their own perceptions. Hasken found himself almost envying her that certainty, even as he recognized it as the dangerous delusion of inexperience. "Child," he said, moving forward again with Thunder Walker following slowly behind, "I have seen many horses die. I know the signs. Thunder Walker grows weaker each day, not stronger. Your herbs may ease his pain, but they cannot restore what has been lost." But Sani refused to move from the path, and her next words carried a desperation that made Hasken's chest tighten despite his resolve. "Please," she said, and now there were tears in her voice, though none fell from her eyes. "Give me more time. Let me show you that healing is possible. Thunder Walker was my father's horse. He is the last piece of swift arrow dancing that remains in this world. If you kill him, you kill the last of my father too." For a moment, Hasken felt his certainty waver. He could see the child's pain, could understand the desperate need to hold onto something that connected her to the parent she had lost. But sentiment, however pure, could not change the fundamental reality of the situation. Thunder Walker was dying, and prolonging his suffering would serve no one, least of all the animal himself. "Your father would want his horse to be at peace," Hasken said gently. "Swift arrow dancing was a warrior. He understood that sometimes the bravest choice is knowing when to surrender. Sani's response was to dart forward and place herself between Hasken and the path to the river, her small arms spread wide as if she could physically prevent what was about to happen. "No," she said, her voice rising. "You will not take him to the water. You will not do this thing." Hasken could have simply walked around her, could have continued to the river despite her protests. But something in the child's absolute determination gave him pause. She stood before him like a small warrior facing overwhelming odds, prepared to fight a battle she could not possibly win simply because surrender was unthinkable. For a long moment, they faced each other in the growing morning light. The experienced warrior who had learned that mercy sometimes required difficult choices, and the determined child who refused to accept that some battles could not be won. Between them stood Thunderwalker, his labored breathing the only sound in the desert stillness. Finally, Hasken made his decision. "Stand aside, little one," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is not your choice to make." He moved forward, leading Thunderwalker around Sani's small form and continuing toward the river. Behind him, he could hear the child's running footsteps as she followed, her voice calling out pleas and arguments that he forced himself not to hear. The hardest choices were often the ones that looked like cruelty to those who did not yet understand the difference between mercy and abandonment. The river lay just ahead, its waters running swift and cold from the recent rains. In a few more minutes, Thunderwalker's suffering would be over, and he would be free to join his warrior in whatever realm awaited brave spirits. It was the kindest gift Hasken could offer, even if a certain small healer would never understand or forgive him for it. The river ran cold and swift between banks lined with cottonwood trees, whose leaves had turned the color of aged copper. Hasken stepped into the water with Thunderwalker beside him, feeling the shock of cold through his moccasins as the current tugged at his legs. The horse followed without resistance, his hooves finding purchase on the rocky bottom with the careful steps of an animal whose strength was nearly spent. This was how it should be, Hasken told himself, clean and quick, with the dignity that a warrior's horse deserved. The current would carry away the pain, the slow dying, the gradual surrender of a spirit too proud to simply fade away in a corral. Thunderwalker would find his warrior in whatever realm awaited them both, and the long suffering would finally end. But as Hasken led the horse deeper into the river, he heard a splash behind him that sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the cold water. Sani had followed them into the river, her small form struggling against a current that could easily sweep away someone her size. Her dark hair streamed behind her as she fought to reach them, her face set with a determination that bordered on desperate. "Sani, no!" Hasken called, instinctively moving to help her even as Thunderwalker stumbled in the swift water. "The current is too strong. Get back to shore." But the child ignored his commands, her attention focused entirely on the dying horse. From somewhere in her clothing, she had produced a small wooden flute, carved with intricate patterns that Hasken recognized as the work of swift arrow dancing. The instrument had been a gift from father to daughter, one of the last things he had made before riding out to the battle that claimed his life. Sani began to play, and the sound that emerged was unlike anything Hasken had ever heard from a simple wooden flute. The melody was ancient, older than memory, the kind of song that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It spoke of healing and wholeness, of spirits finding their way back from the edge of forever. As the notes drifted across the water, thunder. Walker lifted his head with the first sign of real alertness Hasken had seen from him in weeks. The horse turned toward the sound, his dark eyes focusing on the small figure struggling in the current. Something passed between them then, a recognition that went deeper than the bond between human and animal. It was as if Thunderwalker suddenly remembered who he had been before the grief and pain had overwhelmed everything else. Sani waded closer, still playing the healing song her father had taught her during the long winter evenings before his death. Her fingers moved across the flute holes with practiced precision, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the world around them. Even the river seemed to quiet, its rushing sound becoming a backdrop for the melody, rather than drowning it out. "You must stop this," Hasken said, his voice carrying more urgency now. The water was deeper here, and Sani was small enough that a single misstep could send her tumbling downstream toward the rapids that lay 100 yards below. "This is not safe. Return to shore." But Sani lowered the flute and fixed him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "Safety is not the most important thing," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of moving water. "Healing is. Truth is. Love is." She reached into her pouch and withdrew a handful of herbs that had been carefully prepared according to methods passed down through generations of medicine women. Hasken watched in growing amazement as she began to apply them to Thunderwalker's wounds, her small hands working with the confidence of someone who had performed these procedures many times before. The horse stood perfectly still as she worked, as if he understood that this was different from all the previous attempts to help him. Where others had offered sympathy and resignation, this small healer brought something else entirely, a refusal to accept that some battles could not be won. "My grandmother taught me that the body remembers how to heal itself," Sani said as she worked, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting lessons learned by heart. "But sometimes it forgets, especially when the spirit is wounded along with the flesh. The herbs remind the body what it should be doing. The songs remind the spirit why it should want to stay." Hasken found himself drawn closer, despite his intention, to complete the mercy killing as quickly as possible. There was something in the child's methodology that spoke of genuine knowledge rather than wishful thinking. Her movements were too precise, her selection of herbs too specific for this to be mere play acting. "Where did you learn these things?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Sani glanced up at him, her hands never pausing in their work. "A grandmother Ixchel taught me before she crossed over to the spirit world. She said I had the gift for seeing what others could not see, for knowing what the body needed to heal itself. She said the knowledge was too important to die with her." As she spoke, Sani began to examine Thunderwalker with the thoroughness of an experienced healer. Her fingers traced the old scars that marked where arrows and bullets had found their mark during the many battles horse and rider had fought together. But more importantly, she found the places where infection still lingered, where wounds had healed badly and continued to drain the animal's strength. "Here," she said, pressing gently against a spot on Thunderwalker's left shoulder. "And here." Her hand moved to his neck, then down to his front leg. "The poison is still in his blood, but it is not too deep to remove. With the right medicines and enough time, his body will remember how to be strong again." Hasken watched in growing bewilderment as Thunderwalker responded to her touch with what appeared to be genuine relief. The horse's breathing seemed to ease slightly, and his stance became marginally more stable. It was possible, of course, that these were simply the effects of gentle attention rather than any real healing. But there was something in the animal's response that suggested otherwise. "Child," Hasken said carefully, "even if what you say is true, Thunderwalker has lost the will to live. His spirit has already begun its journey to the next world. Medicine cannot call back a spirit that no longer wishes to remain." Sani's response was to rest her forehead against Thunderwalker's neck, in a gesture of such tenderness that it made Hasken's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "His spirit has not gone anywhere," she said softly. "It is hiding, waiting to see if the world still has room for warriors and their horses. He needs to know that he is still needed, that there is still work for him to do." As if in response to her words, Thunderwalker turned his head and gently nuzzled the child's shoulder, the first voluntary movement Hasken had seen from him in weeks. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of recognition, of a spirit acknowledging that it had been truly seen and understood. For the first time since entering the river, Hasken felt his certainty begin to waver. The child's knowledge appeared to be genuine, her methods precise, and most importantly, Thunderwalker was responding in ways that suggested the healing might be more than mere wishful thinking. Perhaps mercy took more forms than he had previously understood. The sound of approaching footsteps on the rocky riverbank caused Hasken to look up from where he stood waist-deep in the cold water. Grandfather Kohana emerged from the cottonwood trees, his weathered face creased with concern, and something that might have been disapproval. The old man's eagle feather headdress, the one Hasken had left abandoned on the bank in his haste to reach the river, hung from his gnarled fingers like a symbol of responsibilities cast aside. "What is this I see?" Kohana asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through 8 decades and earned the right to question any decision. A warrior leading a horse to water and a child risking her life to follow. Hasken felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the cold water surrounding him. To be caught in this moment of uncertainty, with his resolve wavering and his purpose unclear, felt like a failure of leadership that went beyond the personal. "The horse is dying, grandfather," he said, his voice carrying less conviction than he had intended. "I seek to end his suffering." The old man's eyes, still sharp despite his age, moved from Hasken to Sani to Thunderwalker, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had witnessed countless moments of crisis. When his gaze returned to Hasken, there was something in it that made the warrior feel like a child caught in mischief. "And what does our young healer say about this suffering?" Kohana asked, directing his attention to Sani, who continued to work her medicines into Thunderwalker's wounds despite the growing cold and the swift current that threatened to sweep her away. Sani looked up at the elder with eyes that held no trace of the defiance she had shown Hasken. "Grandfather," she said respectfully, "Thunderwalker's body remembers how to heal, but his spirit has forgotten why it should want to. The infection can be drawn out with the proper medicines. The weakness can be overcome with time and care. But the grief—" She paused, her small hands still moving across the horse's coat. "The grief requires a different kind of healing." Kohana waded into the river with the careful steps of someone whose bones ached with age but whose spirit remained undiminished. As he drew closer, Hasken could see that the old man's attention was focused not on the human drama playing out before him, but on Thunderwalker himself. The elder's examination was thorough and professional, the assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the signs that animals carried in their posture and breathing. "Tell me, child," Kohana said, as he ran his hands along Thunderwalker's neck and shoulders, "what medicines have you been using, and how long have you been treating this animal?" Sani's response came without hesitation, delivered in the precise language of someone reciting lessons learned by heart. "Willow bark for the pain and fever, white sage for purification, osha root for respiratory healing, and bear root for the deep infections. I've been treating him for 6 weeks, ever since Grandmother Ixchel crossed over and left me her healing bundle." The specificity of her knowledge clearly impressed the elder, who nodded slowly as he continued his examination. "And what results have you observed? The fever has broken twice, but returns when I miss more than 1 day of treatment. The wounds on his shoulder and neck are closing properly now, though slowly. His appetite has improved, and he drinks water willingly when it is offered with the right herbs mixed in." Sani paused, then added with touching honesty, "But his spirit remains wounded. He does not run or play as he once did. He stands apart from the other horses as if he no longer believes he belongs with them." Hasken watched this exchange with growing unease. The child's knowledge was clearly more extensive than he had realized, and Grandfather Kohana was treating her observations with the respect usually reserved for experienced healers. But knowledge and good intentions could not change the fundamental reality that Thunderwalker was dying, could they? "Hasken running bear," Kohana said, his attention turning back to the warrior. "What do you see when you look at this horse?" The Question seemed simple enough, but Hasken sensed layers of meaning beneath it. "I see a dying animal," he replied carefully. "I see suffering that should be ended with mercy rather than prolonged with false hope." The old man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested disappointment. "Look again," he said simply. "Look with the eyes of someone who understands that healing takes many forms." Hasken forced himself to really examine Thunderwalker, to see beyond his own preconceptions about death and mercy. The horse still stood, with his head low, still breathed with visible effort, still carried himself like an animal whose strength was nearly spent. But as Hasken looked more carefully, he began to notice details that his earlier assessment had missed. Thunderwalker's coat, while still dull, showed patches where new growth was coming in, with something approaching its former luster. His stance, while weak, was not the complete collapse that Hasken had expected to see. Most tellingly, the horse's eyes, when they focused on Sani, carried a spark of recognition and even affection that spoke of a spirit that had not entirely surrendered. "I see," Hasken began, then stopped, uncertain how to articulate what he was beginning to understand. "You see a horse whose body is healing, even if slowly," Kohana finished for him. "You see an animal who responds to the touch of his healer with trust and even hope. You see a spirit that has been wounded but not destroyed." The old man's voice carried gentle reproof. "What you do not see is an animal begging for death." The words hit Hasken like a physical blow. In his determination to spare Thunderwalker from further suffering, had he been projecting his own weariness, his own readiness to surrender, onto an animal who was actually fighting to live? Sani chose that moment to speak again, her voice cutting through Hasken's growing uncertainty like a blade through fog. "Thunderwalker has been telling me his dreams," she said, her words so matter-of-fact that they might have been discussing the weather. "He dreams of running again, of carrying a rider who understands his heart. He dreams of foals who will inherit his courage and his speed. These are not the dreams of an animal ready to die." Hasken stared at the child, searching her face for any sign of deception or wishful thinking. But Sani's expression held only the calm certainty of someone reporting facts as she understood them. Whether her claims about the horse's dreams were literal truth or metaphorical interpretation, they spoke to an understanding of Thunderwalker's condition that went far beyond Hasken's own assessment. "How long?" he asked, the words emerging, almost without conscious thought. How long would this healing take? Sani considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The body will heal in the time the body takes to heal," she said. But if the proper medicines are applied consistently, and if he is not pushed beyond his strength, I believe he could be well enough to ride within 1 season. 1 season. 3 months of careful nursing, of daily treatments, of hope maintained against the evidence of the eyes. It seemed an enormous commitment to make for such an uncertain outcome. And yet, as Hasken looked at Thunderwalker standing patiently in the cold river water, allowing a small child to minister to his wounds with perfect trust, he began to understand that the choice was not really about the horse at all. It was about whether a warrior could learn to believe in healing rather than surrender, in hope rather than resignation. It was about whether mercy could take the form of fighting rather than letting go. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the river became a test of endurance that neither Hasken nor Sani had fully anticipated. Each morning before dawn, the small healer would slip from her guardian's wickiup, carrying her grandmother's sacred healing bundle, a collection of herbs, stones, and ceremonial tools wrapped in soft deerskin that had absorbed the prayers and intentions of countless healing ceremonies. Hasken found himself rising early as well, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and reluctant admiration to witness Sani's daily ministrations. What he observed challenged everything he thought he understood about healing, about persistence, and about the nature of hope itself. The child approached her work with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. She would begin each session by examining Thunderwalker from nose to tail, her small hands reading the story written in his muscles, his coat, his breathing. She seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how each herb and treatment would affect the horse's recovery, adjusting her approach based on subtle changes that escaped Hasken's notice entirely. But it was exhausting work. Sani's dedication came at a visible cost to her own health and well-being. Dark circles appeared under her eyes as she sacrificed sleep to tend to Thunderwalker during the critical hours when his fever was highest. Her small frame grew thinner as she forgot to eat, her attention so focused on her patient that her own needs became secondary concerns. Hasken watched this deterioration with growing unease. The child was pouring herself into Thunderwalker's recovery with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. He began to understand that Sani's commitment went far beyond simple compassion for a suffering animal. She was fighting to save something that connected her to her lost father, something that represented hope in a world that had taken so much from her already. The memories came to Hasken unbidden during these morning vigils, triggered by the sight of Sani's unwavering dedication. He found himself remembering his own battles, his own losses, the faces of warriors who had fallen beside him in conflicts that now seemed to blur together in an endless cycle of violence and grief. There had been the fight at Skeleton Canyon, where 3 of his closest friends had died in a cavalry ambush. There was the raid on the supply train near Tombstone, where young Running Elk had bled out in Hasken's arms, while whispering messages for a wife he would never see again. And always there was the terrible weight of being the one who survived, who carried the stories and the guilt of those who did not make it home. Each loss had added another layer to the armor around his heart, another reason to expect the worst from any situation that required hope or faith. He had learned to anticipate failure, to prepare for disappointment, to choose the certainty of controlled endings over the uncertainty of fighting for impossible victories. But watching Sani work, seeing her refuse to accept that some battles could not be won, forced Hasken to confront uncomfortable questions about his own choices. Had his wisdom actually been cowardice? Had his acceptance of loss been a betrayal of those who deserved to have someone fight for them? Thunderwalker's progress was frustratingly slow, marked by small improvements that were often followed by setbacks that threatened to erase days of careful work. One morning the horse would stand straighter, his breathing easier, his eyes brighter. The next day he might refuse food entirely, standing with his head hanging low as if the effort of recovery had become too much to sustain. During these setbacks, Hasken would catch himself waiting for Sani to finally acknowledge the futility of her efforts. Surely the child would reach a point where even her determination could not overcome the evidence of her eyes. But Sani met each reversal with the same calm persistence she brought to every challenge, adjusting her treatments and redoubling her efforts, as if setbacks were simply part of the natural rhythm of healing. "Why do you continue?" Hasken asked her one morning, after Thunderwalker had spent the entire previous day refusing to eat or drink. "Can you not see that the horse grows weaker rather than stronger?" Sani looked up from where she was preparing a new mixture of herbs, her young face serious but untroubled. "My grandmother taught me that healing does not move in straight lines," she replied, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow student. "The body must sometimes get worse before it can get better. The spirit must sometimes touch the edge of surrender before it remembers why it wants to stay." Her words were accompanied by actions that demonstrated the depth of her knowledge. From her healing bundle, she withdrew a collection of stones that had been shaped and polished by generations of medicine women. Each stone had specific properties, some for drawing out infection, others for strengthening the blood, still others for calming an agitated spirit. Hasken watched in fascination as Sani arranged the stones around Thunderwalker in patterns that followed principles he did not understand. but could not dismiss as mere superstition. The horse responded to each placement with visible relaxation, as if the stones carried some property that his body recognized and welcomed. "Where did your grandmother learn these methods?" Hasken asked, genuinely curious about the source of knowledge that seemed to produce results even when his skeptical mind insisted such results should be impossible. "From her grandmother," Sani replied simply, "and she from hers, going back to the beginning times when the spirits first taught our people how to heal. Grandmother Ixchel said the knowledge belongs to all of us, but some people forget how to listen to what the body is trying to say." As she spoke, Sani began to sing in the old language, her voice carrying across the morning air with a clarity that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the world around them. Thunderwalker lifted his head at the sound, his ears forward for the first time in days, his eyes focusing on the small figure beside him with what appeared to be genuine affection. The song was one Hasken recognized, a healing chant that had been old when his grandfather was young, words that carried the accumulated power of countless ceremonies and the faith of generations who had believed in the possibility of restoration. Hearing it sung by a child who barely reached Thunderwalker's shoulder, seeing the horse respond with obvious comfort and trust, Hasken felt something shift in his understanding of what was possible. Perhaps the child was right. Perhaps healing did not always follow the patterns that experience suggested were inevitable. Perhaps hope was not always foolishness and persistence not always futile. For the first time since the confrontation at the river, Hasken allowed himself to consider the possibility that Thunderwalker might actually recover, that Sani's impossible faith might be rewarded with the kind of outcome that would restore everyone's belief in the power of refusing to surrender. It was a dangerous hope to carry, but as he watched the horse take his first voluntary steps in days, drawn by the sound of Sani's healing song, Hasken found himself beginning to believe that some miracles were worth the risk of disappointment. It was during the 4th week of Sani's healing treatments that Hasken made a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood about Thunderwalker's condition. While helping the child gather fresh herbs from the high meadows above camp, he noticed her examining a piece of worn fabric that had been wrapped around some of her healing stones. The cloth was faded and stained, but Hasken recognized it immediately as part of a war shield cover, specifically the distinctive pattern that had belonged to swift arrow dancing. The geometric designs told the story of the warrior's victories, his spiritual protections, and his connection to the horse medicine that had made him legendary among both Apache and cavalry forces. "Where did you find this?" Hasken asked, his voice tight with sudden tension. Sani looked up from her work, her dark eyes holding secrets that seemed too heavy for someone her age to carry. "It was wrapped around Thunderwalker's leg when he returned from the battle," she said quietly. "Grandmother Ixchel removed it when she first treated his wounds, but she kept it safe for me. She said it held the connection between horse and rider, and that it might be important for healing." Hasken took the fabric with hands that trembled slightly, turning it over to examine the patterns more closely. As he did, something else caught his attention. A dark stain that could only be blood, and embedded in one corner, a small metal object that made his blood run cold. "Sani," he said carefully, "has anyone else seen this cloth? Has anyone examined what is wrapped inside it?" The child shook her head, her attention focused on the herbs she was sorting. "Only Grandmother Ixchel and myself. She said it was not meant for others to see until the time was right." With growing dread, Hasken carefully unwrapped the object from the cloth. What he found was a silver cavalry badge, bent and blackened with age, but still bearing the distinctive markings of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, the same regiment that had been involved in the battle where Swift Arrow Dancing had died. But it was not just any cavalry badge. Hasken recognized the specific markings. The slight dent near the bottom edge, the way the silver had been tarnished by desert sun and mountain snow. He had seen this badge before, worn by a young lieutenant who had fought with desperate courage during a running battle that had lasted 3 days and claimed the lives of good men on both sides. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. The battle at Skeleton Canyon had not been the simple cavalry patrol that the official reports had described. It had been a complex engagement involving multiple Apache bands and several military units, a chaotic affair where allegiances shifted and individual acts of heroism went unrecorded in the formal histories. Swift arrow dancing had been there, fighting alongside Hasken and the other Apache warriors. But so had the young cavalry lieutenant, whose badge now rested in Hasken's palm. The two had faced each other in single combat, a deadly dance between horse and rider that had ended with both men wounded and their mounts scattered by the chaos of battle. What Hasken had never known until this moment was what had happened after he had been forced to retreat with his own wounds. He had assumed that Swift Arrow Dancing had died in that encounter, killed by superior numbers or by the lieutenant's skill with saber and pistol. But the presence of the cavalry badge told a different story entirely. "Sani," Hasken said, his voice heavy with implications he was only beginning to understand. "I need to tell you something about your father's last battle. Something I should have realized long ago." The child looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see more than they should, as if she had been waiting for this moment without knowing what it would bring. "Tell me," she said simply. Hasken settled. Beside her on the rocky ground, the cavalry badge, still warm in his palm from his body heat. "Your father fought in the battle where Thunderwalker was wounded," he began. "But the wounds on the horse, they were not from that battle alone. They were from carrying Swift Arrow Dancing away from danger, from bringing him to safety even when his own strength was failing." As he spoke, the pieces began to fall into place with terrible clarity. Thunderwalker's wounds were not the result of random enemy fire or the chaos of battle. They were the deliberate injuries of a horse who had shielded his rider with his own body, who had absorbed bullets and blade cuts meant for the warrior on his back. The cavalry badge was probably lodged in Thunderwalker's wounds when he carried your father away from the battlefield, Hasken continued. "The horse saved Swift Arrow Dancing's life that day, but the effort cost him dearly. The infections, the fever, the slow decline, they all stem from wounds he received while protecting your father." Sani listened to this revelation with the composed attention of someone receiving information that confirmed suspicions she had harbored but never voiced. When Hasken finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her small hands working automatically with the herbs while her mind processed the implications of what she had learned. "That is why he dreams of carrying a rider again," she said finally. "Thunderwalker saved my father once, but he could not save him from the second battle, the one where father died alone. The horse carries guilt just as people do. He believes he failed in his duty." The insight struck Hasken like a physical blow. He had been so focused on Thunderwalker's physical wounds that he had completely missed the spiritual dimension of the horse's condition. The animal was not simply dying from infection and trauma. He was dying from the same survivor's guilt that had plagued Hasken himself for years. "If that is true," Hasken said slowly, "then healing his body may not be enough. His spirit must also be healed, must be convinced that he did not fail your father." Sani nodded, her young face serious with the weight of understanding. "That is why the medicines alone have not been enough. Thunderwalker needs to know that his warrior was proud of him, that he fulfilled his duty even if he could not prevent." What came after? As they sat together in the growing afternoon light, Hasken felt the last of his resistance to Sani's healing efforts crumble away. The child had been right all along. Thunderwalker could be saved, but only if his healers understood that some wounds went deeper than flesh and bone. For the first time since the confrontation at the river, Hasken found himself wanting to participate in the healing rather than simply observing it. If Thunderwalker carried guilt over his failure to save Swift Arrow Dancing, Then perhaps Hasken, who carried similar guilt over his own survival, could find a way to help both of them find peace. "What must we do?" he asked. And for the first time in weeks, the question carried hope rather than resignation. Sani smiled, the first truly joyful expression he had seen from her since the healing began. "We must help Thunderwalker remember that saving one life is still saving a life, even if it cannot save all lives. We must teach him what you must also learn, that surviving does not make us failures, it makes us witnesses to courage." The revelation about the cavalry badge had opened a door in Hasken's memory that he had kept firmly closed for 2 years. As he held the tarnished silver in his palm, images from that terrible day at Skeleton Canyon flooded back with a clarity that made his hands shake and his breathing become shallow. He remembered the young lieutenant now, barely older than a boy, with fair hair and eyes the color of winter sky. The officer had fought with the desperate courage of someone who knew he was outmatched, but refused to surrender. His horse, a bay mare with white markings, had been swift and sure-footed on the rocky terrain, dancing away from Apache lances with a grace that spoke of excellent training and deep trust between rider and mount. But what Hasken remembered most clearly was the moment when everything had gone wrong. Swift arrow dancing had pressed his attack too aggressively, driving Thunderwalker into close quarters where the cavalry saber could find its mark. The lieutenant's blade had caught the Apache warrior across the chest, a wound that should have been fatal, but somehow was not. That was when Thunderwalker had done something Hasken had never seen from any horse before or since. Instead of shying away from the blade, the stallion had deliberately moved between his wounded rider and the cavalry officer, taking the full force of the lieutenant's follow-up strike across his own neck and shoulder. The horse had absorbed wounds meant for swift arrow dancing, allowing the warrior to escape with injuries that were serious but not mortal. What Hasken had not known, what no one had known, was that the cavalry badge had been driven deep into Thunderwalker's flesh during that exchange, carrying with it fragments of uniform cloth and bits of leather that would fester for months afterward. The horse had carried those foreign objects in his body while he bore his wounded rider to safety, infection building slowly but inexorably beneath skin that appeared to heal cleanly. But there was more to remember, details that Hasken had pushed out of his conscious mind because they were too painful to examine closely. After Thunderwalker had shielded swift arrow dancing from the lieutenant's saber, Hasken himself had moved to attack the young cavalry officer. The boy had been reloading his pistol, momentarily vulnerable, his attention focused on the mechanical process of placing powder and ball, while his horse stood steady beneath him. Hasken could have killed the lieutenant easily. His lance was ready, his angle perfect, the distance exactly right for a strike that would have ended the young man's life before he could complete his reload. But something in the officer's bearing, the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, the calm acceptance of probable death, had reminded Hasken of his own younger brother, killed in a previous engagement. Instead of striking, Hasken had hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, other events had intervened. Swift arrow dancing, despite his wounds, had wheeled Thunderwalker around and charged the lieutenant from another angle. The cavalry officer, startled by this unexpected attack, had fired wild, his shot going high and wide. But the sound of the gunshot had spooked Thunderwalker, already stressed by his wounds and the chaos of battle. The horse had reared, throwing swift arrow dancing from the saddle and leaving the warrior vulnerable on the rocky ground. The lieutenant, showing remarkable presence of mind for someone so young, had immediately moved to take swift arrow dancing prisoner rather than kill him. That was when Hasken had finally acted, but by then it was too late to prevent what came next. His attack drove the lieutenant away from swift arrow dancing, but the damage had been done. The Apache warrior had been wounded again during his fall, more seriously this time, and Thunderwalker had sustained additional injuries while trying to protect his dismounted rider. The battle had ended in confusion and retreat, with both sides withdrawing to count their losses and tend their wounded. Hasken had assumed that Swift Arrow Dancing had died of his wounds during the retreat, and that Thunderwalker's injuries, while serious, would heal given time and proper care. Now, holding the cavalry badge that told a different story, Hasken understood that his moment of hesitation had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to Swift Arrow Dancing's death and Thunderwalker's current condition. If he had killed the lieutenant when he had the chance, Swift Arrow Dancing would never have been unhorsed. If he had acted without hesitation, Thunderwalker would not have sustained the wounds that were still poisoning his system 2 years later. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. Hasken had spent 2 years believing that his survival of various battles was a burden of guilt he must carry alone. But the truth was far worse. His hesitation had directly caused the death of Sani's father and the suffering of the horse she was now desperately trying to save. "You have remembered something," Sani said, her voice cutting through his spiral of self-recrimination with the clarity of someone who had learned to read the emotions written on adult faces. "Something about my father and Thunderwalker?" Hasken looked at the child, this small person who had been working herself to exhaustion trying to heal wounds that he had helped create, and felt something break inside his chest. How could he tell her that his cowardice had contributed to her father's death? How could he admit that the horse she was fighting to save carried infections that might have been prevented if he had acted with proper courage? "Sani," he began, his voice rough, with emotion he could no longer contain. "There are things about that battle, things I should have told you from the beginning," but the child held up her small hand, stopping him before he could continue. "I know," she said simply. "I have known for weeks that you carry guilt about my father's death. I have seen it in the way you look at Thunderwalker, in the way you spoke about mercy and ending suffering. You believe you failed him." The matter-of-fact way she stated this truth left Hasken speechless. He had thought his guilt was hidden, buried beneath years of stoic acceptance and warrior's discipline. But this 8-year-old healer had seen through his defenses as clearly as she saw through Thunderwalker's physical symptoms to the spiritual wounds beneath. "How?" was all he managed to say. Sani moved to sit beside him on the rocky ground. Her small form radiating a calm that seemed impossible given the weight of the conversation. "Grandmother Ixchel taught me that guilt has a smell, a way of moving through the body that healers learn to recognize. She said that people who blame themselves for things beyond their control carry their shoulders differently, breathe differently, look at the world differently." She paused, her dark eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone reading a map. "You have been carrying the weight of my father's death, but you do not carry it alone. Thunderwalker carries the same burden. Both of you believe you failed to save him, but both of you are wrong." Hasken stared at her, unable to process how someone so young could speak with such certainty about matters that had tormented him for 2 years. "You do not understand," he said desperately. "I could have prevented what happened. I had the chance to act, and I hesitated. My cowardice led to your father's death." But Sani shook her head with the patient firmness of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. "My father died because it was his time to die," she said. "The spirits called him to cross over, and no action by you or Thunderwalker or anyone else could have changed that. What you and Thunderwalker did was give him the chance to die as a warrior rather than as a victim." The simplicity of her statement, the absolute conviction with which she delivered it, cut through Hasken's guilt more effectively than any argument or rationalization could have done. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that survival did not automatically equal failure, that witness did not necessarily mean complicity. "The cavalry badge," he said, looking down at the tarnished silver still resting in his palm. It has been poisoning Thunderwalker all this time, carrying infection deep into his body where normal healing could not reach it. Sani nodded. But now we know where the poison comes from. We can draw it out properly. The badge must be removed, and the wounds must be cleaned with medicines strong enough to reach the deepest infections. It will be painful for Thunderwalker, but it will also be the beginning of true healing. As she spoke, Hasken realized that the child was describing more than just physical healing. The process she outlined would require both horse and human, to confront the sources of their deepest pain, to allow old wounds to be opened so that the poison could finally be released. "Will you help me?" Sani asked, her voice carrying a weight of trust that humbled him. "Thunderwalker will need both of us to heal completely. He will need a warrior who understands guilt and a healer who understands hope for the first time." Since Swift Arrow Dancing's death, Hasken felt the possibility of redemption opening before him like sunrise after the longest night. The child was offering him the chance to transform his guilt into purpose, his survival into service. "Yes," he said, and the word carried the weight of a vow. "I will help you heal him, and in doing so, perhaps we can all find peace." The discovery of the cavalry badge marked a turning point that transformed Thunderwalker's healing from a simple medical treatment into something approaching a sacred ceremony. Grandfather Kohana, when presented with the evidence of the horse's true condition, declared that such deep wounds, both physical and spiritual, required the full attention and power of the entire community. "This is not a task for one small healer, however gifted," the elder announced as he examined the tarnished silver badge in the firelight of his wickiup. "Thunderwalker carries poison that has been building for 2 years. To draw it out safely will require medicines stronger than any individual possesses, and prayers more powerful than any single voice can offer." Hasken found himself at the center of preparations that felt more like a war council than a healing ceremony. The irony was not lost on him that a man who had spent 2 years avoiding responsibility for another's death was now taking charge of efforts to preserve life. But Sani's quiet confidence in his abilities, combined with Grandfather Kohana's assumption that he would naturally lead such an effort, left him little choice but to accept the role fate had assigned him. The first challenge was gathering the materials needed for what Kohana described as deep healing, a process that would require not just herbs and traditional medicines, but sacred objects that had been blessed by generations of medicine people. From hidden caches throughout the canyon, the elders produced items that Hasken had never seen before. Eagle feathers that had been carried into battle by legendary warriors, stones that had been shaped by medicine women whose names were spoken only in whispers, and bundles of herbs that had been grown in secret places and harvested according to rituals that predated memory. Sani watched these preparations with eyes that absorbed every detail, her young mind cataloguing procedures and protocols that would serve her throughout a lifetime of healing work. But Hasken could see the weight of responsibility settling on her small shoulders like a heavy blanket. She had begun this effort as a child, trying to save her father's horse through determination and inherited knowledge. Now she found herself at the center of a community-wide effort that would either validate her calling as a healer or mark her as someone whose reach had exceeded her grasp. "Are you frightened?" Hasken asked her during a quiet moment as they worked together to prepare the sacred spring water that would be needed for the ceremony. Sani considered the question with the serious attention she brought to all important matters. "Not frightened for myself," she said finally, "but frightened for Thunderwalker. If this healing fails, it will not be because the medicines are not strong enough or the ceremony is not performed correctly. It will be because his spirit chooses to leave despite everything we can do to make him want to stay." Her words captured something that Hasken had been struggling to articulate even to himself. They were not simply trying to heal an animal's physical wounds. They were attempting to convince a grieving spirit that life was still worth living, that purpose and meaning could be found even after the deepest losses. The parallels to his own situation were uncomfortable to contemplate. How many times over the past 2 years had he stood at the edge of his own metaphorical river, ready to surrender to the weight of guilt and grief? How often had he chosen the familiar comfort of resignation over the uncertain challenge of hope? As the day of the ceremony approached, Thunderwalker himself seemed to sense that something significant was about to occur. The horse showed more alertness than Hasken had seen from him in months, his ears forward and his eyes bright with what appeared to be anticipation rather than resignation. Whether this change represented genuine improvement or simply the animal's response to the increased attention, Hasken could not say, but it felt like a positive sign in a process that had offered precious few encouraging moments. The ceremony would take place at the sacred spring, hidden in the rocks above the main camp, a place where, according to tribal legend, the spirits had first taught the Apache people the arts of healing and horse medicine. Grandfather Kahana had declared that Thunderwalker must be brought to the spring under his own power, as being carried would rob the ceremony of the symbolic importance of the horse choosing to participate in his own healing. This requirement created its own challenges. Thunderwalker had not walked more than a few dozen steps at a time for weeks, and the path to the sacred spring was steep and rocky, demanding strength and sure-footedness that the weakened animal might not possess. But Sani insisted that the horse was ready for the journey, that his spirit had been gathering strength in preparation for this moment. "How can you be so certain?" Hasken asked, as they made final preparations on the morning of the ceremony. Sani's answer came not in words, but in action. She approached Thunderwalker and rested her forehead against his neck in the gesture of communion that had become her signature form of communication with the horse. For several minutes, they stood together in perfect stillness, two beings sharing something that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal consciousness. When Sani finally stepped back, her eyes held a light that Hasken had never seen there before. Not the grim determination that had carried her through weeks of difficult treatment, but something approaching joy. "He is ready," she announced with absolute conviction. "Thunderwalker's spirit has decided to fight for life rather than surrender to death. The ceremony will succeed because he wants it to succeed." The procession to the sacred spring began. At dawn, with Thunderwalker walking slowly but steadily between Sani and Hasken. Behind them came the other members of the healing circle, Grandfather Kahana carrying the ceremonial items, Ixchel many horses bearing the sacred herbs, and a dozen other tribal members who had committed themselves to lending their prayers and intentions to the effort. Thunderwalker moved with obvious effort, but also with unmistakable purpose. Each step seemed deliberate, chosen, as if the horse understood that this journey represented far more than simple transportation from one place to another. This was a pilgrimage, a statement of intent, a declaration that hope was worth the risk. Of disappointment, the sacred spring emerged from the rocks like a gift from the earth itself, its clear water bubbling up from depths that seemed to connect directly to the heart of the world. Smooth stones had been arranged around the spring in patterns that followed principles older than recorded history, creating a natural amphitheater where healing ceremonies had been conducted for countless generations. As they arranged Thunderwalker in the center of the stone circle, Hasken found himself thinking about all the other healing ceremonies that had taken place in this sacred space. How many desperate people had brought their deepest wounds to this spring, hoping that ancient wisdom and spiritual power could accomplish what ordinary medicine could not. How many had left disappointed, and how many had found the miracles they sought. Sani began the ceremony by emptying her grandmother's healing bundle in a careful arrangement around Thunderwalker's recumbent form. Each item had specific significance and purpose: stones for drawing out infection, herbs for purifying blood, feathers for calling upon the healing spirits, and ceremonial tools whose functions were known only to those who had been trained in their proper use. But the centerpiece of the arrangement was the cavalry badge, placed directly over Thunderwalker's heart as a symbol of the foreign poison that had been corrupting his system for 2 years. The tarnished silver caught the morning light like a dark star, representing everything that needed to be healed in order for true recovery to begin. "This is where the deepest healing begins," Grandfather Kohana announced as the circle of participants joined hands around Thunderwalker. Not with the removal of foreign objects from the body, but with the understanding that carrying the wounds of others does not make us weak. It makes us sacred. As the ceremony began in earnest, Hasken felt something shift in his understanding of what they were attempting to accomplish. They were not simply trying to heal a horse's physical ailments. They were attempting to transform the very nature of suffering itself, to show that pain could become purpose and wounds could become wisdom. The question that remained was whether Thunderwalker, and by extension all of them, possessed the strength and courage needed to choose. Healing over surrender, hope over resignation, life over the familiar comfort of giving up. The sacred spring water felt alive in Sani's hands as she lifted the carved gourd that had been blessed by 7 generations of medicine women. The water itself seemed to pulse with energy that went beyond the physical, carrying within it the accumulated prayers and intentions of every healing ceremony that had ever taken place in this sacred space. Thunderwalker lay in the center of the stone circle, his breathing steady but labored, his dark eyes fixed on Sani with a trust that humbled everyone present. The horse had made his choice, to fight rather than surrender, to hope rather than despair. And now it remained to be seen whether that choice would be enough to overcome 2 years of poison and grief. "Begin with the purification," Grandfather Kohana instructed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless healing ceremonies and understood the precise sequence of actions needed to invite the spirit's assistance. Sani poured the sacred water over Thunderwalker's wounds in patterns that followed the 4 directions, each application accompanied by words in the old language that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the world around them. The water ran clear at first, but as it touched the deepest infections, it began to carry away substances that had been trapped in the horse's body for months, dark fluid that spoke of corruption finally being released. Hasken watched in fascination as Thunderwalker's body began to respond to the treatment with visible relief. The horse's breathing eased noticeably, and his muscles, which had been tight with chronic pain, began to relax in ways that suggested genuine healing was taking place. But the physical aspects of the ceremony were only the beginning. Sani reached into her grandmother's healing bundle and withdrew the cavalry badge, holding it up so that everyone in the circle could see the tarnished silver that had caused so much suffering. "This does not belong in Thunderwalker's body," she announced, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "But it does not belong in our hearts either. The guilt and anger and grief that this represents, these things must also be healed. If Thunderwalker is to be truly well." As she spoke, Sani began to sing the healing song that her father had taught her, the melody that had first called Thunderwalker back from the edge of surrender in the river weeks ago. But now the song carried additional verses, words that spoke directly to the spiritual wounds that could not be treated with herbs and sacred water alone. The response was immediate and dramatic. Thunderwalker lifted his head with more strength than he had shown in months, his eyes bright with recognition and something that looked remarkably like hope. The horse struggled to rise, his legs trembling with effort, but his spirit clearly determined to participate actively in his own healing. Hasken found himself moving forward without conscious thought, his hands steadying Thunderwalker as the horse fought to regain his feet. For a moment, warrior and animal looked directly into each other's eyes, and Hasken saw reflected there the same mixture of grief and guilt that had haunted his own dreams for 2 years. "He knows," Sani said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of spring water bubbling up from the earth. "Thunderwalker knows that you blame yourself for my father's death, just as he blames himself. He cannot heal completely until you both release that burden." The truth of her words hit Hasken like a physical blow. He had been so focused on Thunderwalker's physical symptoms that he had missed the deeper connection between them. Two survivors, carrying guilt that belonged to neither. Two spirits wounded by the belief that they had failed someone they loved. Thunderwalker stood swaying slightly, his legs still weak, but his posture proud for the first time since returning from battle. The horse turned his great head toward Hasken, and in that gaze the warrior saw not accusation, but understanding, not judgment, but forgiveness. "Swift Arrow Dancing was proud of both of us," Hasken said, the words emerging from some deep place he had not known existed. "He would not want us to carry guilt for choices that were beyond our control." As if in response to his words, Thunder Walker stepped forward and gently touched his muzzle to Hasken's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance that brought tears to the warrior's eyes. In that moment, something that had been broken in both of them began to heal. The poison of guilt and self-blame finally beginning to drain away like infected fluid from a lance wound. Sani continued her song, but now her voice was joined by the other members of the healing circle, their combined voices creating harmonies that seemed to reach directly into the spiritual realm. The cavalry badge in her small hands began to grow warm, as if the metal itself was responding to the power of the ceremony. Thunderwalker's transformation accelerated with each verse of the healing song. His coat, which had been dull and lifeless for months, began to show patches of the lustrous sheen that had once made him the pride of the Apache horse herd. His stance grew stronger, more confident, as if he was remembering who he had been before grief and infection had reduced him to a shadow of his former self. But perhaps most remarkably, his eyes began to carry the fire that had once made cavalry horses shy away from his presence. The spirit that had made Thunderwalker legendary among both Apache and military forces was returning, called back by the combined power of medicine, ceremony, and the simple refusal to accept defeat. "Look," Grandfather Kohana whispered, his voice filled with wonder, "the spirits accept our offering." The cavalry badge in Sani's hands was beginning to change, its tarnished surface brightening, as if years of corrosion were being stripped away by invisible forces. The silver gleamed like starlight, transformed from a symbol of poison and guilt into something approaching beauty. Thunderwalker took another step forward, then another, his movements growing stronger and more confident with each passing moment. The horse that had barely been able to stand that morning was beginning to move with something approaching his old grace and power. The transformation of Thunderwalker accelerated as the healing ceremony reached its peak. What had begun as a slow, careful treatment of physical wounds had evolved into something far more profound, a spiritual renewal that seemed to affect not only the horse, but everyone present in the sacred circle. Hasken stepped back to give Thunderwalker room to move, watching in amazement as the animal began to walk with increasing confidence around the perimeter of the stone circle. Each step carried more strength than the last, each movement more grace and purpose. The horse that had been dying just hours before was becoming something magnificent again, not just healed, but transformed. Sani held the cavalry badge high above her head, the silver now gleaming like captured moonlight in her small hands. "This badge carried poison into Thunderwalker's body," she announced, her voice carrying across the sacred space with surprising power. "But it also carried something else, the courage of the young soldier who wore it, the honor of the warrior who fought beside my father, the respect between enemies who recognized each other's bravery." As she spoke, Sani began to weave the badge into Thunderwalker's mane with gentle, reverent movements. What had been a symbol of infection and guilt was being transformed into something entirely different, a reminder of honor, courage, and the complex bonds that could exist even between those who fought on opposite sides. Thunderwalker stood perfectly still during this process, as if he understood the significance of what was being done. The silver badge nestled against his dark mane like a star against the night sky, no longer a foreign object causing pain, but an integral part of his identity as a horse who had carried warriors and witnessed courage in its many forms. "The poison is gone," Grandfather Kohana announced, his voice filled with wonder as he examined Thunderwalker's movements, not just from his body but from his spirit. This horse remembers who he is meant to be. The truth of the elder's words was evident in every aspect of Thunderwalker's bearing. His head was high, his eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. His coat gleamed with health, showing the distinctive brown and white markings that had once made him famous among both Apache and cavalry forces. Most remarkably, his movements carried the controlled power and grace that marked him as a warrior's mount, an animal capable of incredible speed, endurance, and battlefield intelligence. But perhaps the most profound change was in Thunderwalker's relationship with the humans around him. Where once he had stood apart, isolated by grief and pain, he now moved freely among the members of the healing circle, accepting their touch and offering his own gentle acknowledgments in return. The horse that had been dying of loneliness was rediscovering his place in the community of living beings. Hasken found himself chosen for special attention as Thunderwalker approached him directly and rested his great head against the warrior's chest. In that moment of contact, Hasken felt the last of his guilt and self-blame dissolve like morning frost in desert sunlight. The horse's acceptance was complete and unconditional, not forgiveness, which implied wrongdoing, but recognition that survival carried its own burdens and its own purposes. "He wants you to ride him," Sani said, her voice soft with emotion as she watched the interaction between warrior and horse. "Thunderwalker wants to remember what it feels like to carry a warrior again, to have purpose beyond simply staying alive." The suggestion seemed impossible. Thunderwalker had been near death just hours before, weak and struggling simply to stand. The idea of mounting him, of asking him to bear weight and respond to guidance, felt like asking too much of an animal still in the early stages of recovery. But Thunderwalker himself seemed to disagree. The horse moved to position himself beside a convenient boulder, his stance indicating readiness and even eagerness to resume his role as a warrior's mount. His dark eyes fixed on Hasken with an expression that was unmistakably hopeful, the look of a creature that had rediscovered its purpose and was eager to fulfill it. "Are you certain?" Hasken asked, addressing the question to both horse and healer. Sani nodded without hesitation. "Thunderwalker's body is healed, but his spirit needs to remember what it feels like to be a warrior's horse again. He needs to know that saving one life, Swift Arrow Dancing's life, was enough to make him worthy of honor." With careful movements that respected both Thunderwalker's recovery and the sacred nature of the moment, Hasken swung himself onto the horse's back. Thunderwalker stood steady beneath him, his posture proud and strong, showing no sign of strain or discomfort. For a moment, they simply stood together, warrior and horse reconnected in the ancient partnership that had defined both their identities. Then Thunderwalker began to move, his gait smooth and controlled, carrying Hasken around the sacred circle with the fluid grace of an animal in perfect harmony with his rider. The members of the healing circle watched in wonder as Thunderwalker demonstrated not just recovery, but renaissance. This was no longer a dying horse being nursed back to minimal health. This was a magnificent animal reclaiming his place as one of the finest war horses in Apache history. As they completed their circuit of the sacred space, Hasken felt something he had not experienced in 2 years, the pure joy of partnership with a horse who shared his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Thunderwalker moved beneath him with confidence and power, every step a declaration that they were both ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The healing was complete, but more than that, it was transformative. Horse and rider had both found their way back from the edge of despair to discover that survival could be the beginning of purpose rather than the end of hope. 3 months after the healing ceremony at the sacred spring, the autumn light painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the transformation that had taken place within the Apache community. Thunderwalker stood in the horse corral, no longer isolated from the other animals, but taking his place as the natural leader of the herd. His magnificent coat gleaming with health and his eyes bright with the intelligence that had made him legendary. Hasken approached the corral in the early morning light, carrying with him a new medicine bundle that Sani had created, a collection of healing herbs, blessed stones, and ceremonial tools that represented the continuation and evolution of her grandmother's wisdom. The bundle was smaller than the traditional ones, sized for hands that were still growing, but it carried the same power and purpose that had guided Apache healers for generations. "Good morning, old friend," Hasken said, as Thunderwalker approached the fence, the horse's greeting warm but dignified, as befitted an animal who had reclaimed his status as a warrior's mount. Thunderwalker's recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Sani's. Within weeks of the ceremony, the horse had regained not just his strength, but his legendary speed and agility. More importantly, he had rediscovered his purpose, showing eager willingness to resume the partnership with Hasken that honored both their roles in the community's survival. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Thunderwalker's transformation was his relationship with the younger horses in the herd. The stallion had begun teaching them, passing on the skills and knowledge that had made him one of the finest war horses in Apache history. Watching him work with a yearling colt, demonstrating the precise movements needed for battlefield maneuvers, Hasken could see the future of the tribe's horse medicine being preserved and transmitted through Thunderwalker's patient instruction. Sani emerged from her guardian's wiki-up, moving with the quiet confidence that had marked her as a healer from the beginning, but now enhanced by the recognition and respect of the entire community. At 8 years old, she had become the youngest master healer in tribal memory, her success with Thunderwalker having established her credentials beyond any possible doubt. "How is he this morning?" she asked, her practiced eye already examining. "Thunderwalker for any signs of problems or changes in condition. Strong and ready for anything," Hasken replied, and it was true. Thunderwalker's vitality seemed to increase with each passing day, as if the healing ceremony had unlocked reserves of strength and spirit that had been trapped by infection and grief. Sani nodded with satisfaction, then reached into her new medicine bundle to withdraw a single eagle feather, pure white with black tips marked with symbols that told the story of Thunderwalker's recovery and rebirth. "This is for you," she said to Hasken, offering him the feather with the solemnity appropriate to such a gift. Hasken accepted the feather with reverence, understanding immediately its significance. In Apache tradition, such feathers were given only to warriors who had demonstrated exceptional courage and wisdom. But this feather carried additional meaning. It represented the courage to choose healing over surrender, hope over despair, life over the familiar comfort of giving up. "You honor me," Hasken said, his voice thick with emotion as he secured the feather in Thunderwalker's mane, next to the cavalry badge that had been transformed from a symbol of poison into a reminder of honor. The placement was deliberate and meaningful. The eagle feather and the silver badge, side by side in Thunderwalker's mane, told the complete story of healing that had taken place, not just the physical recovery of a dying horse, but the spiritual transformation of everyone involved. They represented the possibility that wounds could become wisdom, that survival could become service, and that even the deepest grief could be transformed into purpose. as they worked together to prepare Thunderwalker for the day's activities. Patrol of the canyon's boundaries that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. Hasken reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he had led a dying horse to the river, convinced that mercy required ending rather than fighting. The community had embraced Sani's role as a healer with enthusiasm that went beyond simple acceptance. Families brought their sick children to her for treatment. Elders consulted her about ailments that had puzzled them for years, and even the horses seemed to seek her out when they needed care or attention. Her combination of inherited knowledge and intuitive understanding made her uniquely effective at diagnosing and treating conditions that had baffled others. But perhaps more importantly, Sani's success had renewed the community's faith in their traditional healing practices at a time when government pressure was pushing them to abandon their old ways in favor of modern medicine. The dramatic recovery of Thunderwalker had demonstrated that ancient wisdom still had power in a changing world, that the spirit still answered prayers offered with pure hearts and proper ceremonies. Hasken mounted Thunderwalker with the easy grace of a partnership that had been renewed and strengthened through shared trials. The horse responded to his touch with eager energy, ready for whatever challenges the day might bring. Together, they represented something that had seemed lost forever, the ancient bond between Apache warrior and warhorse, the partnership that had allowed their people to survive and thrive in one of the world's most demanding environments. As they rode out of the corral toward the canyon walls that glowed like flame in the morning sun, Hasken caught sight of Sani watching them. From the camp, the child raised her hand in farewell, her small figure silhouetted against the backdrop of the awakening community. In her other hand, she carried her new medicine bundle, ready for whatever healing work the day might require. The future stretched before them like the vast desert landscape, challenging and uncertain, but also full of possibilities that had seemed impossible just months before. Thunderwalker's recovery had shown them all that healing was always possible, for those brave enough to choose hope over surrender, for those willing to fight for what seemed lost beyond redemption. As warrior and horse disappeared into the golden morning light, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls like a song of renewal, the story of their healing became part of the larger story that would be told around Apache fires for generations to come. It was a story about the power of refusing to give up, about the wisdom that could reside in the smallest and most unexpected places, and about the miracles that became possible when love proved stronger than despair. In the distance, thunder. Walker's proud silhouette moved against the desert sky like a promise that some things, courage, hope, the bonds between living beings, could never truly be broken, only temporarily forgotten until the right healer came along to help them remember who they were meant to be.